There's something funny about the fact that Clayface might understand villain movies better than Sony's entire Spider-Man-less universe. And not because Clayface is some massive A-list Batman villain that everyone's dying to see on the big screen, cause he's not. He's a B-list shapeshifter made of clay, which in the grand scheme of comic books isn't even that weird. But he's still not exactly the safest character to build an entire movie around. Yet from the little we've seen, it looks pretty phenomenal as it dives into body horror and the tragedy of a man losing control of his body and identity. And it's not the first time DC has been able to pull this off. The Joker turned Batman's most popular villain into a psychological character study that descends into madness, while the Penguin took Gotham's criminal underworld and made it The Sopranos. And while Batman is referenced, they never physically showed the character, purely relying on its leads to drive the story forward, which is something Sony has been trying to do for years with Spider-Man villains, except their approach keeps hitting a wall. Where instead of finding genres that actually fit these characters, Sony kept forcing them into the same cookie-cutter plot, where the bad guys are barely a villain and just wind up fighting actual bad guys. And for a while, people were content with that. Heck, it's how Venom ended up with a trilogy. But over time, that formula wore thin as Morbius became the easiest movie to dunk on, and no one went to see Kraven. In theory, they all had potential to be a good film, but they squandered it away to fit within the superhero genre. Meanwhile, DC dived into the psychological and crime-related aspects of its characters to make them not only dimensional, but unique, letting its villains be actual villains. With Clayface once again sparking the debate on two of the most iconic rogues galleries in comics, and if they can be adapted without their titular hero. The easy answer is that Batman villains are products of Gotham and its criminal underworld, making them easier to adapt, while Spider-Man villains usually serve as reflections of Peter himself. But to be honest, I think it's a little more complicated than that, because it's not like his villains only exist when he's around. For example, characters like Norman Osborn, Mysterio, Doc Ock, and so many more have such a rich history within comics, TV shows, and other media to where they have their own journey, insecurities, and goals. Heck, characters like Venom, Hobgoblin, and Black Cat even have their own comic runs. So the material is there, it's just not being used effectively, which makes Sony's failures even more confusing. Cause on paper, this should be easy. For example, you can make a Mysterio movie about a failed actor or effects artist so desperate for recognition that he turns to crime and illusions to feel important. Or a Lizard movie akin to The Fly. Heck, you could even make a movie about Chameleon and make it a spy espionage film about someone who struggles with their own sense of identity. You have the ideas of technological and biological horror, tragedy, obsession, ego, identity issues, and weird comic book nonsense to make something engaging, but no one has taken advantage of it. And I think a part of that comes down to how people were taught to see these characters in the first place. Because for a lot of people, their understanding of Batman and Spider-Man villains didn't start with the comics. It started with the 90s renditions of these characters. Two shows that have not only shaped an entire generation, but all adaptations afterwards. And with Batman the Animated Series, its influence has pretty much defined Batman for the modern era, giving one of the most in-depth looks of Gotham City through a gothic noir lens, creating a dirty yet dazzling city with red skies filled with mobsters, crooked businessmen, and villains running rampant throughout the city, showing a city warped by grief, ego, obsession, and corruption, making characters like Mr. Freeze, Man-Bat, Clayface, Two-Face, and Harley Quinn far more sympathetic. For example, episodes like Heart of Ice redefined Mr. Freeze from being a guy who just liked to steal diamonds into a grieving scientist just trying to save his wife from her illness, which has been the standard ever since. With another example being Feet of Clay, which merged various iterations of Clayface to create a more in-depth story that not only showed his turn to crime, but his metamorphosis into a monster, which, mind you, is animated to an insane degree to where it definitely traumatized a child or two. But dear lord, is it animated beautifully. And that concept carries on to the rest of its cast by playing with various themes and topics to make each one of its villains stand out and make them a tragedy caused by Gotham City rather than some goon of the week. setting the standard for all iterations of Batman since, where things like the Arkham games wouldn't have even existed without it. And mind you, those games are loved and absolutely goated, and it's all due to the influence the 90s series had on it, to the point they even had Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill return to their iconic roles as Batman and Joker. From movies to TV shows and comics, the series changed the game and how people viewed Batman and his universe. Which is why adapting some of these characters feels natural, because they have a clearly defined history in the public eye over the past 30 years to where Batman isn't a necessity. Not because he isn't important, but because Gotham is now the crux of their origins. Which is why a Joker film can work, or a Penguin TV show can be compelling, because the blueprint for those stories have already been created. So using Feet of Clay as the basis of a Clayface movie is not only compelling, but it sticks to the roots of its character, which was directly cited by its screenwriter Mike Flanagan, where this approach can also be applied to characters like Mr. Freeze, Man-Bat, or Poison Ivy in making character-driven stories. But on the other hand, characters like Two-Face, Ra's al Ghul, or Hush require Batman or Bruce Wayne to be involved in their stories. There's a certain balancing act for characters you can have stand alone and those you can't. It's just that so far, DC has been making the right choices in the characters they've been pursuing due to the people pushing for its creation. But when you look at Spider-Man, the animated series, its influence, while also important, has been handled differently. Because while Batman the Animated Series made Gotham the heart of Batman's world, Spider-Man made Peter the heart of its world. And that's not a bad thing, because that's what drove the plot forward. Every villain, crossover, and storyline served to develop Peter and his balancing act of being a hero and a normal guy. He's not some untouchable billionaire standing above the city. He's a broke guy in college trying to work, build relationships, and handle the guilt and responsibility of his past. Where rather than reinventing its villains like Batman the Animated Series did, Spider-Man leaned into the idea that these characters are dark reflections of Peter, people who challenge him physically but also force him to confront something internally, whether that be his fears, anger, insecurities, guilt, and responsibility to show the kind of person he would be if he lost control. And once Peter came to terms with that flaw, the show usually moved on. Not because the villains weren't iconic, but the story was more interested in Peter's journey, rather than dissecting the lives of people like Spot, or The Wall, or Big Wheel, you know, real A-listers. Shifting onto new threats, storylines, or crossovers with heroes like Daredevil, Blade, or the X-Men, which made the universe feel huge, but it also meant that villains weren't typically reoccurring like Batman's were. So the villains that really stood out were the ones that impacted the plot or had enough presence to leave a mark. Characters like Kingpin, Hobgoblin, Morbius, Green Goblin, Carnage, and especially Venom weren't just random obstacles Peter dealt with and forgot about. They would either push the story forward or were an absolute menace, with Venom being the most iconic villain from the series, creating the definitive version of the symbiote saga, framing the suit as an addictive substance that not only made him stronger, but brought out his worst traits. And once Peter ditched the suit and it latched onto Eddie Brock, it created one of his most formidable opponents. Someone terrifying, hateful, and completely obsessed with ruining his life, but also someone who slowly developed into an uneasy ally. So it makes sense why Sony became obsessed with him. Venom was popular, marketable, and visually iconic. So much so that Sony gagged and tied Sam Raimi until he put him in Spider-Man 3, which, to be honest, wasn't the worst adaptation. Goofy as hell, but not bad.
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
The real issue is, ever since 2007, Sony desperately wanted a solo Venom movie to capitalize on his popularity, and a decade later, Venom became the face of Sony's entire Spider-Man-less universe, where rather than picking different iterations like Flash Thompson or Lee Price, they chose Eddie Brock, best known to be a dark reflection of Spider-Man within a universe where he's not allowed to exist in. But once the movie worked financially, from character recognition, Sony got the wrong idea and thought that any character could lead their own movie with minimum effort. Which is how we ended up with a bizarre wave of projects, like the Sinister Six, Kraven the Hunter, Silver Sable and Black Cat, Morbius, Madam Web, and El Muerto, who no one has even heard of, all of which felt like they were made purely to bring in box office revenue rather than a passion for these characters. Which is, problematic, Because if you don't have someone passionately working on obscure characters, no one is going to see your movie, especially if fans of the character still exist. So I'm not shocked they chose Morbius to be their second venture, considering his popularity from the 90s show, and also people just really like vampires. Just look at series like Twilight, but on paper, a brilliant scientist with a rare blood disease trying to cure himself, only to turn himself into a living vampire, is an easy yet compelling story, especially if sticking to a gothic horror. Heck, you could even throw in some romance if you want to feel all warm and gooey inside.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
But the issue is, they were only interested in making a superhero movie, not a horror one. Which, to be fair, having Jared Leto in the movie is scary enough. Where the movie was so tame and dull to the point the whole internet rallied together to make fun of how mediocre it was. With any project after being a desperate attempt for relevance, as the Venom trilogy was running on fumes even with the introduction of Carnage and Null, while Kraven served as the final nail in the coffin after a once again mediocre attempt to make a villain movie, where even an R rating couldn't save them. And that's a problem considering not only are you not branching out of the genre, you're also not letting your villains be actual villains. And that's the part Sony never seemed to understand. A villain movie shouldn't feel like a superhero movie with the hero swapped out. It needs to make its lead selfish, ugly, obsessive, violent, pathetic, or just straight up wrong because that's the appeal. People have always been curious about what leads someone to commit heinous acts. Heck, it's why murder documentaries are so popular. There's always been a morbid curiosity to see someone broken and pushed to their breaking point, which is why DC's projects feel so different. Joker wasn't made because Warner Brothers desperately needed a Batman-less villain universe. Todd Phillips wanted to make a gritty character drama and saw Joker as the perfect vessel for that. Whether you love or hate the movie or consider it a bad adaptation of Joker, it's up to you, but you can't deny the fact it had a clear identity. It's not trying to be a standard comic book movie as it dives into loneliness, alienation, mental collapse, and the birth of Gotham's internal rot. And the same goes for the Penguin. It works because Oz is pathetic, ambitious, manipulative, insecure, and dangerous, but that's what also makes him interesting, especially when competing against Gotham's criminal underworld to where it shows some glimmers of humanity, but also the worst aspects of him. And that same mindset is being applied to Clayface, treating his ailment as something horrific, desperate, and insecure, which once again creates an interesting and captivating character with his own stylistic tone, made by someone with vision in mind. Sony, on the other hand, made projects for the sake of projects rather than having creatives come to them with their own ideas, afraid of doing anything outside the box at a time when superheroes were at their peak of popularity, deciding to stick to the status quo rather than explore the unique and complex themes with its characters. But that's the kind of creative risk these characters need. It's not that Batman villains are better suited for solo stories, while Spider-Man villains are doomed without Peter. It all comes down to the characters they choose to adapt and the kind of story they build around them. Certain characters are just more adaptable than others. And in Batman's case, his rogues have had way more time in the public eye to gain a reputation. Between Batman the Animated Series, the Arkham games, the Nolan films, Joker, Matt Reeves' Batman series, and now potentially Clayface, audiences have been trained for decades on the tragic and psychologically broken characters within Batman's world, giving creatives a bigger interest in the IP due to the timeless foundation that's been created. Spider-Man, on the other hand, doesn't have that same foundation within the public eye. He himself is influential, not his villains. So it's always up to creatives to redefine his villains and repopularize them in the medium, with the Raimi trilogy building off both the 90s show and the comics, helping to redefine villains like Green Goblin, Doc Ock, and Sandman that push other adaptations to use more sympathetic aspects of those characters. But for the most part, this has only really happened in the past 30 years, which sounds like a lot, but in the grand scheme of adaptations, it's nothing in comparison to Batman, who's been an icon since the 60s, giving his stories ample time to grow and develop within an ever-observant public, which is kind of important since most people don't read comics. Typically, people are introduced to the character and their world through movies or TV shows, and that's what ultimately shapes how they view them. And that's why the creative side of this matters, because a strong adaptation can take a character that people barely cared about and make them feel essential. Because the best adaptations don't just copy what already exists, they add something new to the foundation and make people see the character differently. Which is what the 90s did for both Batman and Spider-Man, giving fans something to remember and future creatives something to build from, which is why people still talk about them decades later. Because creativity is what keeps these characters alive. It's the reason why Mr. Freeze went from some guy with an ice gun to one of Batman's most tragic villains, or why the symbiote became one of Peter's quintessential stories to his development. It all comes from creatives who want to explore these characters out of passion. Because when someone actively sees the potential in a character, it can change the entire medium and make them unforgettable. And I really hope Clayface continues to push things in that direction, not just for Batman's sake, but for Spider-Man's too. Because when that happens, it doesn't just make a good adaptation, it gives the next generation a reason to fall in love with these characters all over again, and maybe even inspire them to create something unforgettable.
If you made it this far, please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the kind of content I'm making. This is Balthazar, signing off.